Since the last time we met on Sunday, the world is a different place. Nashville is a different place. It's hard to believe it's only been a week, so much has happened since then. The storms that came through Tennessee on Monday night that took up to 25 lives, injured hundreds more, destroyed homes, buildings, and schools, and left thousands of people without power. The city is still reeling from the damage, and as you drive around, you've probably seen structures with roofs torn off, highway signs, and utility poles that have been snapped in half. Windows can be repaired, buildings rebuilt, but you can't replace a life. We're saddened to hear about the passing of our sister Erin and our brother Josh. Erin is the daughter of one of the men that we support, Brother Rodney Pitts. Josh is a close friend to many who are here. The week has been painful, filled with sleepless nights, moments of fear and heartbreak, tears and grief. Some of you have been working long hours assisting in the relief efforts. When facing disaster and suffering, it's difficult to find something positive to say about it. But this week we have seen the community come together. We've seen friendship on display, generosity, compassion, and an outpouring of sympathy and support. This week has brought us perspective, as Norm talked about. People have reached out. We've taken time to ask those around us, how are you doing? And we've hugged our kids a little tighter before we put them to bed at night. When something like this happens, it brings clarity. It helps us to see the world in a different way, to see our lives in a different way, as they really are, fragile and temporary. And isn't that what we need? Not just in times of trouble and disaster, but throughout our lives to have a sense of clear vision and perspective. This year, our theme at Broadmoor for 2020 is Seeing Jesus. We want to gain a better understanding of who Jesus is, what he means to us, how he changes our lives. So this morning, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the humanity of Jesus and look at some of the emotions that he felt, that he experienced when he was here on this earth. This helps us to understand and realize that the Lord is not just some distant God who is out of touch with what we are going through, that he has no concept of this world and the struggles that we face, but rather, as Hebrews says, he was tempted in every way just as we are, and yet without sin. I'd like for us to think about seeing Jesus as one who feels. And we're going to look at 4 different attributes or emotions that he felt while he lived here on this earth. Jesus felt amazed. To be amazed is to be impressed by something, to be surprised by it. It involves wonder and surprise. It's generally a positive feeling. It's hard to believe that the Son of God could be surprised or amazed by anything. He is, after all, the one who was in the beginning. John says that by him and through him all things were made. He is incredible. He has power and wisdom. The crowds were drawn to him because of the mighty things that he was doing, and they marveled and were amazed and astonished by his deeds. But Jesus was born into the world as a man. He had the same desires, feelings, emotions, frustrations that we have. And yes, there were times when even the Lord of all creation was amazed. Read with me in Luke chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. It says, Now when he concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. And a certain centurion servant who was dear to him was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent the elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving, for he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue. Then Jesus went with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore, I did not even think myself worthy to come to you, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. And when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him and turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant well, who had been sick. Here in Luke chapter 7, we see a man sends messengers to Jesus. This man is well respected. Luke tells us that he is a centurion, a Roman soldier, a man of authority and power, overseeing at least 100 soldiers. He is also wealthy. Centurions during this time were well paid for their services. And verse 5 tells us that he built a synagogue for the Jews. He is a man of resources, no doubt feared and respected here in Capernaum. But Jesus is not amazed by his money or his status. He's not impressed with his building projects or his accomplishments. When one of his servants falls ill, he sends for Jesus. And as Jesus is coming to him in verse 6, he sends more messengers, and he says, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Even though this is a man of high standing, he realized his position. His position paled in comparison to that of Jesus. He goes on to say, just say the word. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. This man recognized, he understood the authority that Jesus had, the power that Jesus possessed, that he had real power to save. After hearing the response, Luke says in verse 9 that Jesus marveled. Jesus was amazed at this. He turned to the crowd and he said, nowhere in Israel have I found this type of faith. Nowhere in Israel. You mean not in Jerusalem at the temple, at the seat of all religious activity. Nowhere in Israel, not even among the scribes and those who studied the law day and night. Nowhere in Israel among the Levites or the family of the high priest. Jesus had not seen this type of faith. What is it that impresses the Lord? What is it that causes him to take notice? Is it our occupation? Is it our education? Is it our physical appearance? Is it the neighborhood that we live in or the house that we've built? Jesus was astonished, not by the physical things that surrounded this great man, but instead it was his heart. It was his attitude. He displayed a spirit of humility. He wasn't too proud, or too arrogant to reach out and to ask for help. And what's interesting, he's not seeking relief or healing for his own benefit, but rather he's reaching out on behalf of one of his servants. It's the type of leader that any soldier would want to follow, someone who puts the needs of others ahead of themselves. He showed a tremendous amount of faith. We're not told if he had seen miracles or had just heard about Jesus and the things that he was doing, but nonetheless, he believed. He believed that Jesus was capable and knew that he could heal this man. He knew that his power, the power of Jesus, wasn't limited by space or proximity. Jesus didn't have to go through some special ritual and perform some long procedure, but just at a word, he could heal this man. Do we have that type of faith in the word of Jesus? Do we hold to his word? Do we put our trust in our lives in the things that he said? And do we believe him to be faithful, to come through, to keep his word? What catches the attention and admiration of the Lord is not how we look, but instead he's focused on the heart. In Psalm 51 and verse 17, it says, "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." Jesus, the Son of God, was impressed by a broken spirit, a contrite or low heart. He was amazed. Secondly, we see that Jesus was anxious. To feel anxious about something is to be worried, to be nervous, to be unsettled. It is a common human emotion. Because we live in a world that is constantly changing, it's filled with unknowns. We cannot predict what is up ahead of us. And so it's easy for us to have a sense of uneasiness about our surroundings, about our future. Like all emotions, there is a spectrum. Some are affected more by this than others. But when we think about Jesus, it's difficult to picture him as someone who would doubt, who would worry, who would be unsettled. After all, he knew all things. He knew the thoughts of those who were around him. He could turn water into wine. He could provide bread for thousands. His disciples must have thought, as long as we're with this guy, we're going to have our needs taken care of. But Jesus, we see from the Gospels, didn't live a life of perfect luxury. He faced many of the same challenges that people in the world today face. And Luke says something interesting in Luke chapter 9 and verse 57 about Jesus' response to a man. Luke 9 and verse 57, it says, "As they were going along the road, someone said to him, 'I will follow you wherever you go.' And Jesus said to him, 'Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.'" There were constantly people who were coming to Jesus, who wanted to be around him. He was a great teacher, and people wanted to listen to the things that he had to say, to see the amazing things that were being done by his hands. And on this occasion, a man comes to him, a person comes and says, "Lord, I want to follow you. I want to go wherever you go." And in response, Jesus paints a picture of what it would be like to be a part of his group, to be in his company, to be traveling around with him. He says, "The foxes and the birds have a place to go, but there is nowhere for the Son of Man to lay his head." In other words, this is not a glamorous ministry that you're asking to join, to be a part of. If you come to be with us, this is what you have to look forward to. It gives some insight into the difficulties that Jesus faced. Essentially, he was homeless, going about from town to town, relying on the provisions and generosity of others, even the smallest animals, in a way, had more security and safety than the Son of God. He had nowhere to lay his head. I think that speaks to his vulnerability. He was uncertain about how to provide for one of the most basic human needs, a place to stay. And certainly this would have produced a feeling of uneasiness and anxiousness. Jesus knows what it's like to be poor. He knows the feeling of not having a place to go, to not feel safe or protected. And if we live in this world, these motions are in many ways unavoidable. All of us at times will have a sense of unease. But we look at the teaching of Jesus and think about, well, how can we manage those things? How can we prevent ourselves from becoming overwhelmed with trouble? In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 31, Jesus is speaking on the mountain to the people in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Therefore do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." Notice some of the important truths that Jesus highlights here. In verse 32, he says that God knows the things that we need. He's not turning his back or ignoring our troubles. He can see what's happening, and he knows. And so what are we supposed to do about it? Second point, he says to keep our priorities in place. What are we seeking after? What are we focused on in this life? Oftentimes, anxiousness is a result of pursuing the wrong things, of setting our hope and our sight on things that are of this world. He says that the Gentiles seek after all these things. They are pursuing the physical. But Jesus says to seek first the kingdom, seek first his righteousness and his ways. And when we do that, the promise is that God is going to take care of us, that God will supply and provide for us. Psalm chapter 40 and verse 17 says, "As for me, I am poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God." No matter where we find ourselves, whatever situation we may be in, we can take comfort in knowing that God sees and knows that he is a help and a deliverer in our time of trouble. Jesus felt anxious. Jesus also felt rejected. Rejection is it's a tough pill to swallow. We want to feel included. We have a need to be accepted, to be validated, to feel loved. When my kids draw something on a piece of paper, they will often bring it into the room to show us. And they're beaming with pride at what they've just created. They'll say, "Daddy, do you like it?" And I'll say, "Yes, I do." And I'll pause for a moment and then I'll say, "What is it?" But they're looking for that confirmation to know that they are valued. All of us want that. In Luke chapter 4, when Jesus is returning to Nazareth, it says in verse 16, Luke 4:16, "And he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and he stood up to read." Jesus is in his hometown, the place where he grew up, a place that is familiar to him. He's in the synagogue, somewhere that he would have frequented often as a young man. This is the town that knows him best, so to speak. They've been around him the longest. He gets up to read in the synagogue, and the place in the scroll that he chooses is from Isaiah 61. It's a prophecy about the Messiah, about himself. And he reads through the passage, and when he sits down, all of the eyes of those who are there are on him, and he says, "Today this has been fulfilled in your hearing." In verse 23, it says, "And he said to them, 'Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, Physician, heal yourself. What we have heard you did at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well.'" These people wanted something more, not just a reading. They wanted to see the signs, the miracles, the great things that he had done in other places. But Jesus wasn't interested in putting on some type of show, pandering to their desires. He reminds them that in times past, God's prophets did not heal every person, did not cleanse every leper. In fact, sometimes he sent them to help the most unlikely people, like a widow in a far country or a Gentile army commander. Even Gentiles were helped. And at this word in verse 28, it says, "When they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath, and they rose up and drove him out of town and brought him to the brow of the hill, on which their town was built, so that they could throw him down the cliff. But passing through their midst, he went away." Quite a homecoming, wasn't it? Moments before this, they're marveling at the gracious words that were coming out of his mouth, verse 22, and now they're ready to throw him off the cliff. It's always amazing to see how quickly people can turn, how they can change from everything's going great, we love you, this is all good, to acting like we can't stand you, we want nothing to do with you. Even Jesus, the Son of God, the one who was full of grace and truth, was rejected. There was plenty of people who did not accept his message. He knew what it felt like to be turned away. And what's amazing about this is that even in the face of this rejection, we see that Jesus didn't try to change his message. He didn't try to convert or rework his message that he was bringing to them. He didn't try to change who he was to fit or suit their expectations. But he continued to speak the Father's will, to fulfill his ministry, even if that meant being an outcast. Do we have that same type of courage and conviction? That even when our decision or what we decide to do causes us to be pushed out or out to be an outcast, we continue to follow that path. In the Old Testament, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are described as foreigners, as sojourners, as travelers. They dwelt in tents. Physically speaking, they didn't have a permanent home. And the same, in a sense, can be said for us today. We are foreigners spiritually. We are outsiders. We are outcasts and aliens. And when the moment of rejection comes, whether that's at work or school or even among our own family, we can take comfort in knowing that we are in good company. We are in the presence of God's people throughout time who have faced the same thing. Which of the prophets has not faced rejection? Which of the apostles did not face resistance? Jesus said in John chapter 15 and verse 18, "If the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you." Jesus knows what it's like to feel rejected. And finally, Jesus felt grieved. He was troubled and upset at times. He openly wept when he saw the pain of those around him who were mourning at the death of Lazarus. He felt sorrow when he came into Jerusalem and reflected on how the city was about to face destruction. He was affected by the problems that happen in this world, things like sin and death. In Mark chapter 14 and verse 32, it says, "And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' And he took with him Peter and James and John, and he began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch.'" Mark tells us that while he is in the garden, he is deeply distressed and troubled. He says he was very sorrowful. Jesus is now bearing under the immense weight of this trial. He knew that the only way for God's will to be fulfilled was for him to go to the cross. He asks his disciples to watch, to pray, to help him in this moment of need, but they are unable to stay awake. The world is full of grief and sorrow. We may have times, we may have periods of our life, maybe even years, where things are going pretty well. But it's only a matter of time before reality hits, before the brokenness of this world catches up with us. And whether that's sickness or senseless violence or some type of disaster, this world is not a place that we want to stay in forever. But we serve a God who is willing to come into that world. And not just to stay perched on a high mountain away from all of our troubles, but he came in and lived among our problems. He suffered with us. He experienced these things alongside of us. And he knows what it's like to suffer. I was staying with the kids one afternoon. My wife went to run some errands. And she came in, and I was downstairs in another room, and she brought the monitor so that I'd be able to know what was happening other parts of the house. When she got back from the store, she came in and she said, "Well, how is the baby doing? Did he sleep?" I said, "I think so. I haven't heard anything." She picked up the monitor and noticed that the sound was turned off. She clicked it a couple of times and could hear crying from a child who was clearly not asleep. In Exodus chapter 3, as God's people are struggling under the weight of Egyptian bondage, the Lord tells Moses that he has heard the cry of his people, that it has come up to his ears. And so it is when we are stricken with grief and with sorrow and tears that God does not turn his back on us. His ears are not shut. His face is not turned. He knows when his children are hurting. He knows our cares. He can see our pain. He's a God of compassion and grace and love, and he is truly the one who is in a place to provide comfort and strength like no one else can. Psalm 116 and verse 1 says, "I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy, because he has inclined his ear to me. Therefore, I will call on him as long as I live." No matter what happens in this world, no matter where we find ourselves, however our circumstances may change, what happens to us or to those that we love, one thing is constant. God is a God of mercy and goodness and grace. And because he is a God who is faithful, as the psalmist says, we can call on him as long as we live. Do you see Jesus as one who feels, as one who can sympathize and understand and know the things that we're going through? And if you're here this morning, have you entrusted your life to him? To give him your heart, to follow him in a world of uncertainty? We're going to close this morning with a song to encourage and to invite any who are here that need to respond to the gospel. If there's something that we can do to help you, please come down to the front as we stand and sing.